He almost didn't show up. Kaylin Moreau had been on dozens of dates before, each one more exhausting than the last. Women who knew too much about his net worth. Conversations that circled shallow waters. He'd mastered the art of small talk, of showing up without ever being present. The quiet suit, the expensive watch, the polite nods, they were all part of his armor. So when his assistant pushed the idea of a blind date in a town where nobody knew him, he agreed, not because he believed anything would come of it, but because it was easier to say yes than to explain why he kept saying no. He wasn't expecting magic. He wasn't expecting challenge. He wasn't expecting her. But the moment he walked into that quiet restaurant, tucked between an old bookstore and a wine shop, his breath caught. She was already there, sitting at the corner table near the window, hair swept to the side, eyes steady, expression unreadable, dressed in black with a bold red scarf, a sleek wheelchair beneath her. She didn't stand. She didn't need to. In that moment he knew this wouldn't be like anything he'd done before. There's a moment, quiet, barely noticeable, when we all make decisions about people. Sometimes it's the way they walk into a room. Sometimes it's how they don't look at us. Kaylin had done it too. Over and over, judged, measured, and calculated who was safe, who was real, and who just wanted something from him. It wasn't pride. It was protection. But here's the thing. Just as he had been busy building a wall around himself, there were people who looked at him and made their own assumptions, that he was aloof, that he didn't care, that his silence was cold. And what about you? Have you ever sat across from someone and pretended to be more confident than you felt? Have you ever held back a truth, not to deceive, but to protect something fragile inside you? This story isn't just about Kaylin. It's about all of us, how we hide, how we long to be seen, and how, every once in a while, someone surprises us enough to see what's still soft underneath. This isn't about private jets or luxury dinners. It's not about power, prestige, or how much someone's worth on paper. This story is about two people who thought they were done trying. One had everything money could buy, but couldn't remember the last time someone reached for him without expecting something in return. The other had lost what she once believed defined her, and learned, through fire, how to rebuild from nothing. Kaylin Moreau may have signed billion-dollar contracts, but he hadn't let anyone into his real life in years. Not since the betrayal that taught him trust came with a price. And Aveline Ilan, she wasn't looking to be someone's inspiration. She wasn't waiting to be saved. She had already fought her battle, and won. But neither of them expected what would happen when their worlds collided on a quiet night in San Moriel. No warning, no fanfare, just two people, guarded, scarred, and tired, accidentally walking into something real. Not perfect, but real. And sometimes, that's the only kind of story that matters. So stay with me. Because this isn't just a love story. It's a reminder that what we see at first glance isn't always the full picture. Sometimes the person who changes your life doesn't come with grand gestures or sweeping charm. Sometimes they arrive quietly and refuse to look away when the truth shows up. If you've ever felt overlooked, if you've ever held back because you thought your scars made you too hard to love, if you've ever believed that maybe, just maybe, someone out there could see past your walls and stay, then this story is for you. Aveline never asked to be admired. Kaylin never expected to be undone, but one unexpected meeting forced both of them to confront what they were truly afraid of, being seen. So grab your headphones, turn off distractions. Let this story unfold around you. And before we begin, whether you're new here or one of my returning friends, thank you for watching. If you love heartfelt stories about second chances, healing, and raw, imperfect love, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Mr. George has something unforgettable for you tonight. Kaylin Moreau stepped out of the black sedan with the same practiced ease he wore in every public moment. No flash, no entourage, no designer logos, just a charcoal button-up, sleeves casually rolled, and a soft grey jacket that whispered neutrality. That was the point. To blend in, to feel invisible for once. The restaurant didn't look like much from the outside, and that was why he'd chosen it. A little place called Etta's Table, nestled between an old wine shop, and a barber that looked like it hadn't changed since the 70s. There was no valet, no host trailing behind, just a quiet front door and a bell that chimed when he stepped in. He glanced around. Dim lighting, low conversation, a couple in the far booth clinking glasses, 2 women laughing near the back. The kind of place people went for conversation, not Instagram. Good. His assistant had insisted on this blind date, said it would be good for him, like he was some machine needing recalibration. Kaylin almost laughed at the idea. These things never ended well. He'd meet someone eager, a little too interested, maybe pretending not to recognize him, but the flicker in their eyes always gave it away. Curiosity, calculation. He'd perfected the routine. Charm just enough. Keep details vague. Escape politely. He exhaled, scanned the room, and waited for disappointment to find him. But it didn't. She was already there. Kaylin spotted her at the table by the window, the one reserved under the name his assistant had given, a quiet corner space meant for privacy. He paused. His posture straightened almost unconsciously. She wasn't what he expected, not even close. Her hair was pulled back in a smooth knot, a few tendrils falling loose like she'd let them escape on purpose. A dark green blouse draped over her shoulders, elegant and understated, paired with soft, black pants that matched the sleek frame of the wheelchair she sat in. Quiet, commanding. Her fingers danced slowly across the edge of a water glass, her nails painted the color of crimson wine. Her eyes, calm and observant, flicked toward him the moment he hesitated. There it was, that second of stillness. The pause. Kaylin didn't flinch, but internally something shifted. He hadn't prepared for this. Not for the quiet strength that seemed to radiate from someone not trying to impress, not angling for advantage, not even standing. She didn't need to. Aveline Elan didn't rise from her chair. She didn't wave or adjust anything. She simply watched him approach, chin lifted, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady. She'd caught that flicker in his face. Of course she had. She was used to it. The surprise, the calculation, the quiet inventory of who she must be. But she didn't meet it with apology. She met it with silence so composed it felt like confidence wearing velvet. Kaylin walked over and sat down, feeling for the first time in years that he was the one being measured. Kaylin sat down slowly, the smooth leather seat feeling suddenly unfamiliar beneath him. He placed his phone face down on the table, a gesture he rarely made unless he was forcing himself to be fully present. He hadn't said a word yet. Not hello, not nice to meet you. And yet the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was alert, alive. Aveline tilted her head, her eyes locked on his like she was watching him do math in real time. She had seen the flicker, the subtle pause when he noticed the chair. Most people thought they hid it well. The brief scan, the internal recalibration, that 1 second that screamed more than any misplaced word. She didn't call it out. She didn't offer explanation or soften the space between them. She just waited, calm, poised, almost curious. Kaylin finally found his voice. Aveline? Her lips curled into something close to a smile, but not quite. Kaylin, right? Or do you go by something less formal on blind dates? He blinked. She was fast, sharp, the kind of person who could cut through any pretension with just a look. He nodded. Kaylin's fine. He cleared his throat. Sorry, I just didn't expect. He stopped himself, careful not to finish the sentence. It would only betray how unprepared he'd been. For her. Didn't expect what? She asked softly, the smile deepening. Someone seated before you got here. He let out a breath, half laugh, half release. Touché. The moment froze, but it didn't break. Something about the stillness had held them both in place, and when it resumed, they weren't strangers anymore. Not entirely. The waiter approached, but Aveline raised a hand gently. Give us a minute, she said, without looking away from Kaylin. The server nodded and stepped back. Kaylin leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table. "So," he began, grasping for footing, "did they tell you anything about me?" "Only that you're a friend of Lena's," she replied, "and that you've been in San Moriel for a while. But like most men here, no one really knows why." He smirked. "That sounds ominous." She shrugged. "Doesn't have to be. Some people are just passing through, others are hiding, and some are recovering." Kaylin blinked. "Which one do you think I am?" She sipped her water, then said, "Too soon to tell. But you have the shoulders of someone who carries a lot, and the eyes of someone who won't put it down." He wasn't used to this. Most dates reach for compliments or approval. Aveline, instead, reached for clarity. "I can't tell if that was therapy or a warning," he said, amused. "It was both," she said without missing a beat. They talked about everything but business. She told him about growing up in a home where books were currency and ballet shoes outlasted birthdays. He listened, really listened. It surprised him how easy it was to stay quiet when she spoke. He offered bits of his own life, carefully trimmed. His mother's garden, his long walks in silence. Nothing about money, nothing about tech, and she didn't press. There were no questions about what he did, just questions about who he was. And it had been so long since anyone had asked that he wasn't sure he remembered how to answer. But for the first time in years, he wanted to try. By the time their entrees arrived, Kaylin had forgotten the quiet calculation that usually sat behind his eyes. He wasn't studying her anymore. He was learning her. He noticed how she didn't fidget or glance at her phone, how her gaze stayed where it belonged, right in front of her. She was present in a way that disarmed him. Not intense, not performative, just there. And it made him want to be there too. She teased him about his cautious bites, accused him of being overly polite, and when he laughed, a full open laugh, it startled them both. It had been a while. "I'm sorry," he said, recovering. "I think I forgot how to act normal on these things." "Maybe that's a good thing," she replied. "Normal's usually boring and fake." He paused. "You think I'm fake?" "I think you're still deciding who to be with me," she answered honestly. "But I also think you want to get it right." It landed hard. Not because it was critical, but because it was true. For so long, Kaylin had worn personas the way others wore tailored suits. Confident, controlled, impenetrable. But with Aveline, none of those masks made sense. She wasn't impressed by them. She wasn't chasing them. She was curious about the man underneath. And in that moment, Kaylin realized something simple and terrifying. He wanted her to know him. Not his portfolio, not his headlines. Just him. When the night ended, he walked her to the door. No kiss, no rush. Just a quiet look exchanged between two people who had met unexpectedly in their most honest form. And for Kaylin Moreau, that was the rarest connection of all. The night air outside Etta's table had that quiet, coastal chill. Cool enough to make Kaylin wish he'd brought something heavier than his jacket, but not enough to hurry the moment. Aveline wheeled alongside him without asking if he'd walk her out. She just knew he would. And somehow he appreciated that more than any thank you or farewell hug. "Do you always escort your blind dates to the sidewalk like a gentleman?" she asked, tilting her head toward him with a slight smirk. "Only the ones who don't run screaming halfway through," he replied. She chuckled. "So, what? You've survived worse." "Oh, definitely," Kaylin said. "There was one who told me she was clairvoyant, said she could sense my aura, was blue. Maybe that means you're sad. Maybe it means I should have ordered dessert." That made her laugh, fully this time. It startled him how much he liked the sound. They reached the corner of the block, neither of them moving to end the night. The silence returned, but this time it was a good kind of pause. An open door instead of a closed one. Aveline looked toward the small cafe across the street, a string of warm bulbs glowing above its window. "You scared of caffeine after dark, Kai?" she asked, using the name his assistant had booked the reservation under. He hesitated for a half. "Second. Depends. Is this the kind of place where I risk being asked about my childhood trauma over espresso?" She smiled. "Only if you order black coffee." Those people are dangerous. He laughed again. Then I guess I'm going in. And just like that, the date that should have ended 3 blocks ago kept going. Because she said if, and he said yes. The cafe smelled like roasted beans and old wood. It was the kind of place that hadn't been remodeled to impress. The floors creaked. The chairs didn't match. A small vinyl player spun something soft and wordless near the window. Kaylin followed Evelyn inside, noticing how she moved with ease. No apology, no hesitation. People greeted her like she was part of the space, familiar, belonging. She led him to a table near the back where the light pooled in a soft circle above them. So, she said, placing her phone face down. Why San Moriel? He leaned back. Needed quiet. She raised an eyebrow. You live somewhere loud. Used to, he said. San Moriel doesn't ask questions. Except for me, she teased. He smiled. You're not the town. No, she said thoughtfully. But I am a little nosy. Their drinks arrived. Hers a flat white with cinnamon, his a cappuccino with too much foam. I used to dance, she said after a beat. Before the accident. Now I study movement from the outside. He paused, surprised by her openness. You curate, he said. I observe. Collect. Arrange. She looked at him. Art is just story told without permission. I like that. She traced the rim of her cup. Do you collect anything? Moments, maybe. I used to paint. You don't anymore. He shook his head. Life got louder. She nodded slowly, understanding what he didn't say. Their eyes held for a moment too long. The cafe around them faded into background noise. They weren't flirting. They were talking, really talking. And it had been years since Kaylin had spoken this freely without trying to impress or escape. It felt easy, familiar, uncommon, like he'd stumbled into something fragile but real. When the barista called out the drinks again, refills this time, Evelyn glanced up. Name? She asked him casually, like it was a detail she'd simply forgotten to collect. Kaylin hesitated. It wasn't panic. It was habit. Names carried weight. His real one came with expectations, background checks, curiosity that never slept. He'd learned long ago that the moment people knew who he was, the room changed. Conversations tilted. Motives shifted. Kai, he said instead, smoothly. Most people call me Kai. Evelyn studied him, not suspicious, just attentive. Kai, she repeated, testing it. That fits. Relief settled in his chest. Quiet, but real. She didn't ask for a last name. Didn't push. Didn't make it a thing. She simply accepted what he offered and carried on, like trust was something given first, not earned later. So, Kai, she said, leaning back slightly, what do you do when you're not hiding in small towns? He smiled at the phrasing. I help build things, physical things. Sometimes, he replied. Sometimes ideas. That sounds vague on purpose, only because I'm still figuring out how to explain it to myself. She laughed softly. Fair enough. The ease of it unsettled him. How natural it felt to be known by a simpler name. How freeing it was to speak without guarding every sentence. Across the table, Evelyn met his eyes. You know, she said gently, people tell you more when you don't ask for everything at once. He nodded, feeling the truth of it settle in his bones. Tonight, he was just Kai, and for the first time in years, that felt like enough. The second round of coffee was half empty. The words between them weren't as measured anymore, just small truths, passed back and forth like secrets too light to break anything. Evelyn glanced at the clock but didn't comment. Kaylin leaned on his elbow, watching her hands move as she spoke. She had a habit of tracing shapes with her thumb on the side of her cup, like her thoughts needed somewhere to land. Tell me one thing you're proud of, she said. He blinked. Proud of? Yes. Not business, not achievements, just something personal. Something that wouldn't make sense on a resume. Kaylin looked down for a moment. I raised my younger brother, he said finally. Not all the way, but more than anyone else did. She nodded once. No dramatics. Just acceptance. That counts, she said. A lot. There was a pause, gentle, reflective. The kind that lingers not because there's nothing to say, but because the silence is saying enough. Are you feeling this connection too? Because sometimes it's the quiet conversations that stay with us the longest. If this story is tugging at something real in you, hit that like button. And if you've ever had a first date you didn't expect to matter, but did, share your favorite moment in the comments. We'd love to read it. And hey, if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe for more stories that speak to the parts of us we sometimes forget how to explain. There's more ahead, and you don't want to miss it. Kalin sat on the edge of his bed, laptop open, coffee untouched. The clock read past midnight, but sleep was nowhere near him. Not after a night like that. He hadn't meant to look her up, not at first. But the curiosity had been gnawing at him since he left the cafe. She hadn't asked a single question about his life, his work, his name. And somehow that made him want to know everything about hers. He started with the obvious. Aveline Elan, San Moriel. The first article was from 5 years ago. Local dancer injured in highway crash, returns to art through curation. A photo accompanied the headline, a younger version of her mid-spin, caught in motion, light on her feet. Then another, taken months later, seated in a wheelchair, holding a paintbrush with a child beside her. She'd been 22 when it happened. One drunk driver, one curve in the road. The crash shattered 2 vertebrae and ended her ballet career. The doctors said she'd never walk again. They were right, but they didn't say anything about leading again. Kalin scrolled further. She had founded a small non-profit, Canvas Without Borders, a program that helped disabled children express themselves through movement and visual art, not for sympathy, not to be brave, just to create. And suddenly, the woman who had sat across from him, sharp, funny, composed, was no longer just a surprising date. She was someone who had stared down loss and rebuilt something better. He stared at the screen, heart quieter than usual. There was strength in her that had nothing to do with posture or performance. It wasn't pity he felt. It was awe. She remembered the sound first, not the crash itself, but the sudden silence that followed it. One moment, Aveline was counting beats in her head, her body still, warm from rehearsal, muscles loose in that familiar post-dance calm. The next, she was staring at a sky she didn't recognize, lying sideways, her breath coming in short, confused bursts. Pain arrived late. Shock held it back. Voices blurred around her. Someone kept telling her not to move. She tried anyway, out of instinct more than fear, and that was when she knew. Her legs didn't answer. Not even a twitch. In the hospital, time stretched into something shapeless. Days filled with tests. Nights filled with quiet panic. Doctors spoke carefully, choosing words that sounded gentle but landed heavy. Permanent, unlikely, adjustment. Ballet had been her language, her future, her way of making sense of space and feeling. Losing it felt like losing air. The worst part wasn't the chair. It was the stillness. Rebuilding didn't come with inspiration speeches or sudden clarity. It came slowly, ugly at first. She learned how to sit without collapsing inward, how to ask for help without disappearing, how to grieve the girl she had been without erasing the woman she could become. Art entered her life by accident, a borrowed sketchpad, a paint set left behind by a friend who didn't know what else to bring. She painted badly at first, then honestly, then often. Creation replaced movement. And somewhere between frustration and persistence, Aveline found a new center, not in her legs but in her voice. Kalin parked across the street and sat in his car for almost 10 minutes. He hadn't planned to come. The gallery's website had listed an open studio session for the Canvas Without Borders program, and curiosity had turned into something stronger. He didn't text her, didn't announce himself. He just showed up, hood low, sunglasses on, sleeves rolled to his elbows like every other quietly curious man in San Moriel. The building was modest, no marble, no polished glass. Inside, the walls were covered in finger paint, sculpture, and storyboards. Tables were set with brushes, chalk, and bright-colored paper. It smelled like glue sticks and acrylic paint. Then he saw her. Evelyn wasn't wearing anything like the polished green blouse from their date. Her hair was tied up in a messy knot, sleeves smudged with blue and yellow streaks. But the way she moved through the room, steady, encouraging, deeply present, stopped him in place. A boy in a wheelchair wheeled up beside her with a wobbly drawing in his hand. She leaned down, really looked at it, and said, "This line right here, that's the one that says, 'I'm not afraid anymore.'" The boy beamed. Another child called her over. She rolled herself across the room effortlessly, passing supplies, nodding at work, giving space without taking over. Kaylin stood in the doorway, invisible and completely undone. This wasn't charity. This wasn't performance. She wasn't trying to inspire anyone. She was living, with clarity, with joy, with purpose. And for the first time in a very long time, he didn't feel like the most capable person in the room. Kaylin walked out of the studio slower than he'd entered. The air felt different, cooler, sharper. He leaned against the side of his car and let the moment settle. There were no paparazzi, no meetings, no one texting him for decisions or deadlines. Just the quiet realization that for the first time in years, someone else's world had pulled him in, and he didn't want to leave it. Evelyn hadn't mentioned any of this, not the foundation, not the kids, not the hours she spent giving others a voice. She didn't wear her struggle like a badge. She didn't need him to know in order to be understood. But now that he did know, he couldn't forget it. He thought about all the rooms he'd walked into where people stood to greet him, hoping to impress. All the projects built for scale, for speed, for return. None of them made him feel the way her workshop did. Watching her with those children, seeing how they clung to her words like anchors, Kaylin didn't just admire her. He didn't just like her. He believed her. In what she was building, in what she gave away without fanfare, in the kind of impact that couldn't be measured by charts or revenue. It wasn't attraction anymore. It was alignment. He wasn't sure what role he'd play in her story, or if she'd even let him in further than she already had. But he knew one thing. He wanted to be part of something that mattered, something real, something that looked like this. And when he thought of where that started, the answer was clear. Her. There was no announcement, no grand decision to keep seeing each other. It just happened, quietly, naturally. One afternoon became 2, then 3. A short walk turned into an hour on the sand. A quick chat over coffee evolved into gallery strolls where time moved differently. They fell into a rhythm, one Kaylin hadn't realized he missed until it was already guiding his days. They met at the pier on Thursdays. Evelyn liked the light at that time. The way it stretched across the water without being too harsh. She didn't mind the way her wheels moved over the wooden boards, even if they rattled more than they should have. Kaylin never tried to help, unless she asked. That she liked even more. Sometimes they didn't talk at all. They just sat, watched the tide shift, watched the world pass without needing to keep up. Other days they walked the beach path, a gentle route winding near the shore. Evelyn would tell him stories about the local artists she curated for the gallery, who always ran late, who painted in absolute silence, who needed a playlist before their brushes could even touch canvas. Kaylin found himself looking forward to these small stories more than the news alerts that used to dominate his mornings. She took him to a pop-up exhibit once, local, scrappy, full of raw sketches and odd sculptures made from discarded metal. He stood in front of a wireframe piece that made no logical sense and waited for her opinion. "It's a mess," she said, "but it's honest." And that stuck with him. In her presence, honesty didn't feel like confession. It felt like air. They weren't dating, not officially, but they weren't strangers either. And every shared moment became a thread, connecting, tightening, pulling them towards something unnamed. And still, she never asked what he did. They sat beneath a canopy of driftwood and wind, just off the walking path where the beach gave way to quiet dunes. Evelyn had brought a blanket, folded neatly into her backpack. Kaylin carried 2 mugs from the coffee cart near the pier. Her cinnamon tea, his black with honey. The conversation that day wandered like the tide, uneven, honest. He didn't mean to talk about his mother. It slipped out after a moment of silence, the kind that comes when people aren't filling space just to avoid it. She used to hum while cooking, he said quietly. Never words, just notes. The same 3 or 4, over and over. Aveline didn't interrupt. She didn't lean forward or prompt him like she was mining for something. She just listened, eyes steady, hands still in her lap. She was a night shift nurse, always tired, but she'd come home and still make pancakes on Sundays. I used to think that meant something, like effort was love. Was it? She asked. He shrugged. I don't know. I think she did what she could. But love wasn't loud in our house. It was quiet, like passing you the salt without asking, or folding your shirt before work. A gull cried in the distance. He blinked, like pulling himself out of a fog. My dad left early, he added. Didn't write. Didn't visit. I stopped wondering why after a while. And now? She asked. Kaylen paused. Now I think I just don't like being needed. It makes people unpredictable. She let that sit. No pity, no reassurances, just space. You know, Evelyn said finally, most people spend their lives hoping someone will need them. He looked at her. And you? I'm not most people. That made him smile. It wasn't the kind of conversation he was used to. No expectations. No rush to comfort or correct. Just a moment shared between two people who had both learned to live with the silence and found each other in it. It happened without planning. One moment they were talking about nothing important, how the sea sounded different at night, how San Moriel felt quieter after 10, and the next, the space between them had narrowed without either of them moving. They were at the gallery after hours. Aveline had stayed late to rearrange a small installation, and Kaylen had lingered nearby, hands in his pockets, watching her work. The room was empty except for them and the soft hum of overhead lights. You don't hover, she said suddenly. He frowned slightly. Is that a compliment? It is, she replied. Most people hover, or help too much. I figured you'd ask if you needed it. She met his eyes then, really met them, and something shifted. Not dramatic, not sudden, just present. Kaylen stepped closer, close enough to notice the faint scent of citrus from her lotion, close enough to feel the warmth she carried even in stillness. His hand rested on the back of her chair, not gripping, not guiding. Just there. Aveline's breath caught, almost imperceptibly. You ever feel like time slows down right before something important? She asked. Yes, he said, voice lower than before. Their faces were inches apart now. He could see the flecks of gold in her eyes, the steadiness in her expression. There was no rush, no urgency, just permission hovering between them. He leaned in, not quickly, not fully, just enough to make the intention clear, and then a phone rang, Aveline's. They both froze. She let out a breath that was half laugh, half sigh, pulling back slightly as she reached for it. I'm sorry, she said. I should take this. Kaylen nodded, forcing a smile. Of course. She answered, her tone shifting back into work mode, but the air between them had changed. When she finished the call, neither of them spoke about what almost happened. They didn't need to. They both felt it, and that made walking away harder than either of them expected. He didn't return her text the next morning, not because he was disinterested, but because he wasn't ready to admit just how deeply he was. Kaylen sat alone in his rented apartment, staring out at the waves. The view was the same one he'd admired when he first arrived in San Moriel, a kind of emptiness that had once felt peaceful, now suddenly felt cold. He thought about last night, about the moment he almost kissed her, about how natural it had felt, how real, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. This wasn't a game. She wasn't another date to politely conclude with a thank you text and a firm boundary. She wasn't guessing his worth. She wasn't asking for proof. She wasn't performing. She was just her. And somehow, that made her more dangerous than anyone who had ever wanted him for his last name or his balance sheet. She didn't need him. She saw him, and Kaylin didn't know how to hold that without ruining it. He'd spent years building distance into his life. It had served him, protected him, kept the world at an arm's length where it couldn't surprise or wound. But with Evelyn, the distance kept collapsing. Every time she looked at him like he mattered without explanation, he felt the edges of his old armor start to loosen. He checked his phone again. Still her message, waiting. Had a good time yesterday. No pressure. Just wanted to say thank you for staying late. Short, simple, uncomplicated. And that made it worse. Because if she had demanded something, more answers, more attention, he could have dismissed it. But she didn't. She just left the door open, and he wasn't sure if he could walk through it without bringing all his ghosts with him. So he sat there, phone in hand, heartbeat loud in the silence, and waited. The call came in just after noon. Kaylin was at his desk, flipping through a stack of mock-ups for a pitch he hadn't looked at properly. His thoughts kept drifting back to the last time he saw Evelyn, her voice in the gallery, the stillness in that almost kiss, the text he still hadn't answered. Are you alive, or just avoiding your entire life again? Lena's voice cut through the speakerphone with her usual mix of sarcasm and concern. I'm breathing, Kaylin muttered, closing his laptop. That count for something? You've been ghosting everyone, including the team in Berlin, and I'm pretty sure you haven't sent any updates to your tax attorney. Thanks for the lecture, he said, rubbing his temple. There was a pause. Then her voice softened. It's her, isn't it? He didn't answer. I've seen you disappear before, Kai, she said. But this isn't the same. You want something this time. You care. He exhaled. She doesn't know who I am. She knows who you are, Lena corrected. She just doesn't know what you do. Big difference. It's not that simple. It is, she snapped. You're lying by omission, and you know it. Silence stretched again. You can't build something honest on a lie, she added more gently. Especially not with someone who's been hurt by people pretending to be what they're not. That last line landed hard. She deserves the truth, Lena said. And you deserve a shot at something real. Kaylin stared at the phone long after the call ended. He wasn't afraid she'd hate his money. He was afraid it would change how she looked at him. Afraid it would replace the version of Kai she trusted with someone she never asked to meet. And that fear was beginning to cost him more than he expected. The words came easier than he expected. It was late, nearly 1 a.m., and Kaylin sat on the floor of his living room back, against the couch, phone in one hand, glass of untouched whiskey in the other. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made everything echo too loud inside his head. He opened a blank message. Her name was already saved. Just Evelyn. No emojis. No unnecessary punctuation. Just clean, direct and terrifying. He typed, I haven't been completely honest with you. Not because I don't trust you, but because I didn't want to ruin the one thing in my life that felt normal. Delete. He tried again. I don't usually talk like this. Or care like this. And the truth is, I'm scared that when you find out who I really am, you'll feel like the version you met wasn't real. Delete. He stared at the blinking cursor for a long time. Then he typed slower. I'm not just Kai. I'm Kaylin Moreau. I've spent most of my life trying to keep people from seeing the full picture, because when they do, they stop talking to me like I'm a person. He stopped, felt the weight of it. You never asked what I did. You never needed anything from me. That's why this matters, and that's why it's terrifying. He paused, thumb hovering over send, but he didn't press it. Instead, he saved it to drafts and set the phone down face down beside him. The silence returned, because the moment he sent that message, everything would change. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't ready for things to stop feeling simple. Not yet. She noticed the change before it had a name. Kaylin still showed up, still walked beside her, still answered her texts. But something had shifted. Not in words, in weight. He smiled at the right times, listened closely, asked about her week. But the ease that once came naturally between them had started to feel managed, as if he was trying too hard to keep something beneath the surface. Aveline had seen it before. That flicker in someone's eyes, the moment they started guarding their steps, not because they didn't care, but because they cared too much. They were sitting outside her gallery one evening, just after sunset. The street was quiet, the sky deep orange behind the storefronts. She had brought out 2 cups of herbal tea. Kaylin held his like it was a shield. "Did I say something wrong?" she asked, gently. He looked at her, surprised. "What? You've been somewhere else lately?" Kaylin exhaled. "I've just been busy." Aveline didn't nod, didn't let him off the hook. "You don't have to explain it," she said softly. "I'm not asking for more than you're willing to give. But I need to know one thing." He looked at her, every part of him tightening. "What are you afraid of?" The question landed with a kind of quiet he couldn't deflect. He opened his mouth, closed it again. The truth sat heavy on his tongue, begging to be spoken. But all he said was, "It's complicated." Aveline held his gaze for a long beat, then nodded slowly. "I thought maybe it was," she said. "I just hoped it wasn't me." He looked down, unable to answer that without telling her everything. And that was something he still wasn't ready to do. They didn't speak again for a while. Not because there was nothing to say, but because they both knew the next words would change something. Kaylin sat with his elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on a crack in the pavement. Aveline waited, not impatient, not demanding, just still. Eventually, he let out a breath that felt like it had been held for years. "I'm not afraid of you," he said, voice low. "I never thought you were," she replied. "I'm afraid of not knowing what's real anymore." That made her look at him, really look. There was no accusation in her gaze, just quiet understanding, one that had come from having to rebuild her own definition of reality. "I've spent most of my adult life watching people study me before they even speak," he continued. "They look me up, read the headlines, do the math. And by the time we sit down, they've already decided who I am and what I'm worth." Aveline didn't interrupt. "With you, it's been different. You didn't ask. You didn't search. You didn't try to fit me into anything." He paused. "And I didn't want to ruin that. So you stayed silent," she said. "I did," he admitted. "Because silence felt safer than seeing the shift. The moment your eyes stop looking at me and start looking at the version of me that shows up on magazine covers." She didn't respond right away, just folded her hands in her lap, watching him. "It's hard," she finally said, "to be seen for the first time and still feel like you have to hide." He looked up at her then, something in him softening. She wasn't angry. She was hurt, and that was worse, because it meant what they had was already something worth protecting, and possibly something he'd already begun to damage. It started with a notification she didn't even mean to open. Aveline had been searching for a local supplier to sponsor a youth exhibition. Her browser tabs were cluttered with art vendors, grant applications, and cafe partners. In the middle of it, an auto-suggested headline slid across her screen. "Kaylin Moreau acquires Seed Bridge in Quiet Coastal Deal," dated just 2 weeks ago. The name stopped her cold. She clicked, half curious. The photo loaded slowly, but when it did, there was no mistaking it. His face, same jawline, same watch he wore the night they first met, same quiet eyes she'd learned to read by instinct. She scrolled. The article mentioned a string of silent acquisitions across the tech space. Strategic, calculated. One paragraph stood out. In a move characteristic of Moreau's low-profile approach, the recent deal was finalized over dinner at Etta's table, one of the Moreau Group's earliest boutique hospitality investments. Her stomach dropped. The restaurant, their first meeting place. Her fingers hovered over the trackpad. She wanted to close the tab, to pretend it didn't matter. But it did. He hadn't just left out the truth. He had built their entire story on familiar ground that wasn't theirs. It was his. She clicked through 2 more articles. Press photos, quotes, all confirming what she now understood. Kaylin Moreau wasn't hiding from the world. He had chosen to hide from her, and now that she knew, everything they had shared felt different. Lighter, thinner, like a story with one page missing, and it was the one that mattered most. She walked past the restaurant the next day, not meaning to stop. But her wheels slowed as she approached the familiar entrance. The glass door, the soft chime, the corner table near the window where they had first met. Everything looked the same. Except, now, it didn't. Etta's table hadn't been just a charming place tucked into the block. It hadn't been neutral ground, chosen by fate or convenience. It was his, one of many under a silent corporate umbrella she never thought to question. He'd picked the spot, reserved at the table, watched her roll in, knowing exactly where they were, and that she didn't. The difference wasn't about money. It was about control. He had owned the setting, the script, the stage. And all the while, she thought they were meeting as equals, strangers, finding something unforced in a place neither of them had claimed. Now, it felt curated. She wasn't naive. She understood discretion, understood what it meant to guard parts of yourself. But this wasn't just omission, it was positioning, a story shaped by silence. And she told herself she could trust him, because of the pauses, the listening, the gentle restraint that had made her feel safe. That trust cracked now, not shattered, but split just enough to let the questions in. Did he choose her, or did he just like how uncomplicated she made him feel? Was she someone he wanted, or someone who conveniently didn't ask too much? And worst of all, had she been honest in a room where he never meant to be? She didn't raise her voice. That was what made it worse. They were standing just outside the gallery, the late afternoon sun catching the glass behind them. Kaelin had arrived, thinking it was just another quiet check-in, another attempt to smooth over the tension he knew he'd caused. Aveline looked at him steadily, no anger in her eyes, just resolve. "I know who you are," she said. His chest tightened. "Aveline, Kaelin Moreau," she continued. "Founder, investor, the man behind half the companies being talked about this quarter." She paused. "The owner of Etta's table." He went still. "I didn't go looking for you," she added. "It found me." Silence stretched between them, heavy, unavoidable. "You lied about who you were," she said again, this time quieter but sharper. "I didn't lie," he said instinctively, then stopped himself. "I didn't tell you everything." She nodded once. "That's a lie." He opened his mouth to explain, but she held up a hand. "You sat across from me and let me believe we were meeting on equal ground. You let me speak freely while you knew things I didn't." Her voice didn't shake. "That matters. I never meant to hurt you," he said. "I believe that," she replied. "But intent doesn't undo impact." Her words settled between them, precise and final. This wasn't about wealth or status. It was about trust. And in that moment, Aveline understood something painful and clear. The man she had let in had chosen not to meet her fully where she stood. Kaelin didn't chase her at first. He stood there, still as stone, the weight of her words pressing down in all the quiet places he'd never let anyone reach. But something in her eyes, disappointment, not disdain, made him step forward. "Aveline," he said softly, "please, just let me say one thing." She didn't nod. She didn't walk away either. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to see that first," he said. "Not because I thought you'd use me, or because I didn't trust you, but because I wanted to know what it felt like to just be a man. Not a name, not a title." His voice cracked slightly, but he kept going. "I've spent years watching people shape themselves around my bank account, change their tone, their expectations, their attention. I didn't want that with you." He looked at her fully now. "You were the first person in a long time who didn't try to angle me into a corner. You weren't impressed by anything I did because you didn't ask. You saw me. Or at least, I thought you did." Aveline didn't move. Her expression didn't shift. "I just wanted to be enough," he said quietly, "without the money." There was no performance in his voice, no strategy, only a man standing in front of someone who mattered, knowing full well that the truth had come too late. The wind picked up slightly, tugging at the hem of Aveline's coat. Still, she didn't move. She let Kaelin's words hang there, gentle, desperate, unfinished. Her voice, when it came, was calm, measured, but not detached. "I understand the fear," she said. He looked at her, unsure of where this was going. "I felt it too. The need to protect something fragile. To test if people care about you or just what you represent." She shifted her chair slightly, angling herself to face him fully. "But the difference is, I still showed up." He blinked. "You knew I'd been through enough to value honesty," she continued. "You saw that I didn't lead with judgment, that I gave you space to be whoever you said you were." Kaylin swallowed hard, but said nothing. "And yet," she said softly, "you didn't trust me to see you." That hit harder than any raised voice ever could. "You say you wanted to be enough without the money, but what hurts is, maybe you didn't think I was strong enough to love you with it." She wasn't accusing him, she was revealing her own wound, one he hadn't considered. "You asked for honesty, Kai," she said, the nickname now sharp with memory. "But you never gave me the choice to meet you with my own." He looked down, unable to meet her eyes anymore. Not because he didn't care, but because, for the first time in a long time, he truly didn't know if he deserved what he was trying to hold on to. The silence between them stretched, no longer uncertain, but filled with everything neither of them could undo. Aveline didn't ask him to leave. Kaylin didn't ask to stay. They simply sat in the discomfort of truth, two people who had both meant well and still managed to miss each other. She turned back toward the gallery, unlocking the door with one slow motion. "Take care of yourself," she said gently, not as dismissal but as closure. Kaylin stood there for a moment longer, but he didn't follow. Not this time. He watched her go, watched the door close softly behind her. And then he walked away, not out of pride, not out of defeat, but because he finally understood that some moments aren't about fixing. They're about facing. Have you ever had someone hide something from you, not to hurt you, but because they were afraid you wouldn't stay if you knew the truth? Tell us in the comments. Have you ever forgiven someone for that kind of silence? Or did you walk away, knowing trust is built on choice, not protection? If this chapter spoke to something real in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. These are the kinds of stories we tell here, honest, quiet, and full of the mess we call love. Kaylin didn't answer calls that week. Not from investors, not from Lena, not even from the board chair who had been waiting for an update on their expansion into Europe. Meetings were cancelled, emails sat unread. His executive assistant, trained to manage high-pressure chaos, was left with nothing but vague out-of-office notices and silence. He turned off his phone by the second day. The apartment, once a place of strategic rest, became something else entirely, a kind of holding space where time passed but little happened. He let dishes pile up, let sunlight come in without adjusting the blinds. He didn't shave, didn't check stock tickers, didn't read the tech reviews that usually filled his mornings. He wasn't avoiding responsibility, he was shedding it. For the first time in years, he wasn't being followed by headlines or held up by expectations. There was no one to impress, no one to shield himself from. And yet, none of it brought him peace, because the one person whose presence had started to matter had now vanished from his world. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she had asked for truth, and he had handed her hesitation. The paints were in a wooden box he hadn't opened in years. They were tucked away in the back of a closet, behind old legal pads, rolled sketches from, abandoned projects, and a weathered box of letters his mother had written but never mailed. He found the brushes wrapped in a towel, brittle at the tips, the handles worn smooth. He didn't plan to use them, but the silence in his apartment made noise of its own. And one afternoon, with no intention at all, Kaylin pulled a canvas from the corner, set it on the dining table, and started moving color across the surface. It didn't look like anything. Not at first. Blues, grays, a streak of red he almost covered but decided to keep. He didn't sketch, didn't outline, just let his hands remember what they used to do before he'd learned to calculate the cost of every move. Painting had been his language before code, before strategy, before his name meant something outside his own home. Now, it was the only place where nothing had to make sense. He didn't sign the work. He didn't even title it. He just let it dry. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like something inside him had started to move again. The donation went through under an alias, no public fanfare, no in honor of dedication, just a clean wire transfer routed through a private philanthropic account, tied to a limited company name that meant nothing to anyone but Kaylin. He didn't want her to know it came from him. It wasn't about guilt, and it wasn't an apology dressed as generosity. It was something else, something harder to explain. The work she did with those kids, the way she gave them language and confidence through brush strokes and shapes, that had moved him. Before the fallout, before the silence, she had created a space that made people braver. He couldn't give her trust back with money, but he could make sure that space survived a little longer, expanded, reached more hands that needed it, and maybe, in some invisible way, that gesture would speak what his words hadn't. When her foundation sent out their monthly update to donors, the newsletter mentioned the gift briefly. A quiet miracle, an anonymous contribution large enough to fund 3 new community programs through spring. Whoever you are, thank you for believing in the work. He read it once, then closed the email. He didn't reply, didn't need to. Some offerings don't come with signatures. He didn't write the letter on his phone. He used paper, the kind that absorbed ink unevenly, forcing him to slow down, forcing him to think about each word before it stayed. He started twice and tore both pages in half. The third time, he didn't try to sound calm, or strong, or reasonable. He just wrote, "Aveline, I'm not writing to ask for anything. I know I lost the right to do that the moment I chose silence over trust. I've spent my life believing that control was the same thing as safety, that if I managed every detail, nothing could reach the parts of me that still hurt. You saw me without asking for proof, without demanding explanation, and I mistook that gift for something I could protect by hiding. You were paralyzed in body. I was paralyzed in soul, but only one of us had the courage to live. I don't know what happens after this. I only know that meeting you changed the way I see honesty, and myself. You don't owe me forgiveness, or time, or another conversation. I just needed you to know the truth, fully and without armor." He folded the letter once, then again, and left it by the door until he was ready to let it go. She found it 2 days after it was delivered. The envelope had no return address. Her name, handwritten. No flourish, no weighty signature, just her name. Aveline sat with it in her lap for a full minute before opening it. She didn't rush, didn't try to predict what it might say. She unfolded the letter and read it once, slowly, carefully, without blinking too much. Then she read it again, and again. By the 4th time, her eyes landed on one line that refused to let go. You were paralyzed in body. I was paralyzed in soul. But only one of us had the courage to live. She stared at that sentence long after the letter had been folded back into itself. She didn't cry. She didn't text him. She didn't throw it away. She slid the letter into the drawer next to her bed and closed it gently, like she was placing something fragile somewhere safe. Some truths don't demand instant reactions. They ask for silence, for space, for breathing room between impact and reply. Aveline didn't know what she would say, or when, or if, but she knew this much. He had finally told the truth. And now, the next step belonged to her. It arrived on a Thursday afternoon. A simple cream envelope tucked into the mail slot at the gallery. No branding, no dramatic cover. Just a small embossed card with the exhibit title centered in bold, unadorned lettering. Unbroken, The Art of Becoming Private Showing, Saturday, 6 p.m. San Moriel Arts Collective. Aveline turned it over in her hands, scanning for a curator's signature, press contact, anything that might explain why it had landed in her mailbox. Nothing. She hadn't submitted any work recently, hadn't signed up for joint exhibitions, or listed her students for a showcase. Still, something about the phrasing stopped her. The Art of Becoming. It didn't sound like a group show. It sounded personal, reflective, like someone had stitched the title together from pieces of her own journey. She set the invitation on her desk and stared at it for a while. Not because she was unsure about attending, but because something inside her already knew this wasn't just another event. It was a message, a bridge, or maybe a question waiting for her to say yes. Evelyn picked up her phone, opened her calendar, and blocked the time. She didn't call anyone, didn't tell her assistant. She just circled the date quietly and let herself feel the pull of a story that wasn't quite finished. The first thing she noticed was the lighting. Soft, warm, not sterile like most exhibitions. It felt less like a gallery and more like a quiet confession told through frames. Evelyn rolled in slowly, her wheels silent on the polished floor. At first, she assumed it was coincidence, the way the wall on her right displayed sketches from the after-school art program she ran. But then she spotted a piece she knew by heart, Jordan's bold color block from last fall. The one he'd called Noise That Finally Makes Sense. Her fingers gripped the wheels tighter. She moved further in. Maya's watercolor, Leo's clay sculpture, a group piece her students had made for Disability Awareness Month, the one she never submitted anywhere, and then her own. 2 canvases she hadn't shown in years. One, a charcoal rendering of the view from her hospital bed. The other, an abstract self-portrait titled After the Fall. The entire exhibit was a map of her work, her influence, her story, told through the eyes and hands of those she had touched. But it was the final piece that brought her to a full stop, a large, untitled painting centered at the far end of the gallery. The brushstrokes were raw, deliberate. It was a dark green room lit by a single window. 2 figures at a table, one seated, still, the other leaning in, mid-conversation. It was them, their first date, her in the wheelchair, him at the edge of himself. It was unmistakable. It was a memory made visible, and whoever painted it had been watching not just with eyes, but with feeling. He was standing in the far corner of the room, near the emergency exit. Not near the painting, not near her, just watching. Kaylin didn't make a move when she entered. He didn't approach when she stopped in front of the final piece. He simply waited, hands clasped loosely in front of him, jacket folded over one arm, head slightly bowed. Gone was the polished precision he wore in public. No tailored suit, no silent entourage, just a plain navy shirt, jeans and shoes that looked like they'd been walked in more than styled. He wasn't there to impress. He wasn't there to be forgiven. He was just there. The soft hum of gallery lights filled the space between them, steady and unbothered. When Evelyn finally turned toward him, their eyes met across the room. No shock, no performance, just the heavy stillness of recognition of 2 people who had already said everything without saying it all at once. Kaylin took a single step forward, then paused. He didn't speak, didn't smile. He waited. Whatever came next would be hers to decide, and for once, he wasn't trying to lead, or fix, or explain. He was just standing still, letting her see him, letting her decide if what remained was enough. She didn't rush toward him, didn't demand answers or fall into silence. She simply rolled forward until they stood face to face, the painting still behind her like a witness. Kaylin's throat tightened, but he didn't look away. Evelyn's gaze was steady, wounded but not vengeful. "You lied," she said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a dagger. It was a truth she'd carried long enough to speak without shaking. He nodded once, slowly, no denial, no defense. "Yes," he said. "I did." A few visitors moved quietly behind them, giving them space. The gallery had become its own kind of hush, holding them in place, wrapping every word in stillness. Evelyn glanced back at the painting, the table, the window, the way he had seen her that night, even when she hadn't asked to be seen. "You remembered every detail," she said. "I never forgot any of them," he replied. She returned her focus to him. "I wasn't asking for perfection," she said. "I was asking for honesty." Kaylin nodded again. "And I failed." The simplicity of their exchange said more than 1,000 explanations ever could. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't even about anger anymore. It was about truth. and whether something broken could still be acknowledged with grace. She had said her piece. Now, the next words would have to come from him. Kaelan took a breath, not rushed, not shaky, but full. He didn't look at the painting. He looked at her. "I lied," he repeated, "but never about how I felt." His voice wasn't dramatic. It didn't rise or tremble. It just landed between them, low and steady. "Everything I said to you," he continued, "every moment we spent together, that was the truest part of my life in years." Aveline didn't interrupt. She let him speak. "I didn't tell you the whole story because I was scared you'd stop seeing me the way you did in that cafe. Like I was enough as I was. Without the layers, without the name." He swallowed. "But nothing I felt was false. Not the way I listened, not the way I looked at you, not the way I kept coming back, because I couldn't not." His eyes searched hers, not for mercy, but for meaning. "I didn't want to hide. I just wanted to be someone you could believe in." Before you saw the headlines, the room around them stayed still, as if giving them permission to exist there a little longer. He wasn't asking her to undo anything. He was offering her the only thing he had left, the truth. He didn't plan it. There was no script in his mind, no dramatic cue to make the moment memorable. He just looked at her, at the strength in her stillness, at the quiet dignity she carried like breath, and he knelt, not fast, not theatrical, just one knee to the ground, eyes level with hers. Aveline blinked, stunned not by the gesture, but by the absence of ego in it. There was no please, no expectation, no pressure. It was a man choosing stillness, choosing closeness, choosing to meet her exactly where she was, not above, not ahead. Beside, she studied him. The same man who had once felt unreachable now sat at her eyeline, unguarded and small in the best way. He didn't reach for her hand. He didn't lower his head. He simply let himself be visible, fully, openly, and somehow that meant more than any apology could. Because this wasn't about earning her forgiveness. This was about being willing to be seen, without defense, without armor, without the fear that had built the silence between them. Aveline didn't speak, not yet. But something in her posture softened, just a little, and Kaelan didn't need more than that. Not today. They didn't call it starting over. There were no declarations, no clean slates. Just a gentle shift. The kind that happens when two people stop trying to protect themselves and start learning how to be in the same room again, without flinching. After the exhibit, Kaelan didn't ask when he could see her next. He didn't suggest dinner or coffee. He simply texted her the next morning, "I'm at the pier, just walking, no pressure." She showed up an hour later. They didn't talk about the letter, or the painting, or the moment in the gallery when he knelt without asking for anything. Instead, they walked, slowly, side by side. The waves came and went in the background, and for a while, that was enough. Days passed like that. Not planned, not avoided. They just happened. A shared lunch on the museum steps, a quiet morning where they sketched side by side in the park, neither of them claiming to be good at it. Texts that didn't ask for responses, responses that didn't carry expectation. Kaelan learned how to pause mid-thought and let her speak first. Aveline learned how to ask for space without retreating. They didn't avoid hard questions, but they didn't force them either. It wasn't about picking up where they left off. It was about creating something new with less fear and more room to breathe. They weren't rushing toward anything. They were just learning to stand still without running. Together, their days didn't need structure. Their time together didn't need a name. They started meeting at the overlook just past the edge of the beach path, an open stretch where the sun dipped low enough to pour gold across the water. Kaelan would bring coffee, Aveline, sketchbooks. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they didn't. It was the kind of comfort that didn't demand conversation. On Thursdays they visited the museum, not during open hours, but after. One of the security guards had worked with Aveline on an accessibility exhibit the year before, and quietly granted them access once the lights dimmed and the doors locked. There, in the silence of wide corridors and echoing walls, They found something unexpected. Freedom. They didn't whisper like most guests. They laughed. They wandered through installations barefoot and played silent games of which piece would you steal if you could. Aveline's wheelchair zipped through the open halls with ease, and one night, Kaelin dared her to a race. She won, grinning hard enough to forget the years when movement had once felt like loss. He let her win, but not by much. There were no roses, no white tablecloths, no driver waiting by the curb. Just paint-stained clothes, slow walks, and soft looks that lasted longer than they used to. Kaelin stopped checking his calendar. Aveline stopped guarding her reactions. They didn't call it healing. They didn't call it anything, but piece by piece, something inside both of them began to mend, not with noise, but with stillness. Not through promises, but through presence. It was just after sunset. They were sitting on the old bench behind the gallery, the one Aveline had, once painted over in blue streaks because the original color bothered her. The sky above was fading into violet. The town felt quiet in that comforting way, like the world was letting them exist without interruption. Kaelin's hand rested on the bench between them. Not reaching, just near. Aveline had been talking about one of her students, a girl who refused to use red paint, claiming it made her feel too loud. Kaelin smiled as he listened, but his mind was somewhere else. Not far, just deeper. When she paused, he spoke. I used to think I'd already missed it. She looked over. Whatever it was supposed to be, he added. Love, a real connection. I figured I'd already traded it for something else. Success, privacy, control. I told myself that was the deal. Aveline didn't speak, just listened. But this, he said quietly, nodding toward the space between them, this isn't a second chance. She tilted her head slightly, curious. He looked at her, and his voice softened. This is my first real one. No theatrics, no speech, just a man, stripped of layers, finally understanding what it meant to be fully present in a life that wasn't built around hiding. Aveline didn't reply right away, but the way she reached over, gently brushing her fingers across his hand, said more than words ever could. She believed him. And, more importantly, he believed himself. It happened without orchestration, no candles, no music, no perfect lines. They were in the sculpture hall, closed for renovation, but Aveline had keys. It had become their hideaway, where they wandered between unfinished pieces and whispered thoughts that didn't need polishing. She was tracing the lines of a marble figure with her eyes, fingers tucked in her lap. Kaelin stood a few feet away, watching, not the sculpture but her, the way she tilted her head, the way her silence always held meaning. You always look like you're listening to something, he said. I am, she answered. Everything speaks if you give it space. Kaelin stepped closer, not fast, not slow, just sure. There had been tension before, moments where closeness nearly turned to more, interrupted by noise, fear, or doubt. But not this time. This time, they both stayed. He leaned in, eyes searching hers. She didn't flinch. She didn't brace. And when his lips met hers, it wasn't a climax. It was a continuation, a seal over everything unspoken, a vow made in silence. It was soft. It was steady. It was not a kiss born of rescue or escape. It was the kind born when two people finally stop pretending that brokenness makes them less worthy of love. When they parted, Kaelin didn't speak, but Aveline whispered, I believe you. It wasn't just about who he was or what he had hidden. It was about everything he had shown her since. And in that quiet, lingering moment, Kaelin finally understood. He had never needed to be someone else. He had only needed to be seen, and still chosen. The gallery was packed, not in a grand red carpet sort of way, but with a hush that settled over the crowd like reverence. There was no spotlight, no dramatic music, swelling from hidden speakers, just soft lighting, the hum of humanity, and the raw echo of art speaking its truth. At the center stood Aveline, not in designer silk or flawless makeup, but in her favorite navy wrap dress, the one that made her feel like herself. Her chair didn't glide silently, it clicked softly on the wooden floor. Still, she moved with ease, with authority. Behind her were pieces curated from across the city, vibrant collages from the children she taught, sculptures from emerging artists with disabilities, and bold, emotionally bruised canvases that didn't flinch from pain. But front and center was that painting, the one that mirrored a night under fairy lights and quiet laughter, the one Kaylin had created from memory. Evelyn cleared her throat. I used to believe that healing meant returning to who I was before. That strength meant silence, and that love was for people with fewer dents. She glanced briefly at the crowd, then back at the painting. But I've learned something different. She let the silence breathe. Love isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about seeing the beauty in what still breathes, in what's changed, cracked, yet still alive. There were tears in the room, but not pity, only recognition, the kind of ache that says, "Me too." And Kaylin. He listened like her words were the air he needed to stay alive. As the applause swelled, a soft rising tide rather than a crashing wave, Kaylin didn't rush forward. He didn't need to. He waited until Evelyn turned slightly, her hand brushing her lap, the smallest of gestures that said, "I'm ready for you now." Then, and only then, he stepped beside her, not to claim credit, not to eclipse her light, but to share the moment in the way it was meant to be shared, with equal weight and quiet reverence. He didn't touch the microphone, didn't say a word. He simply stood at her side, his presence a silent vow. For someone whose identity had once been chained to headlines and hedge funds, this simplicity was revolutionary. The cameras in the room didn't flash wildly. The moment wasn't dramatic. But for those who were watching closely, it was profound. Kaylin didn't reach for her hand. He let her decide. And after a breath, she did. Her fingers slid into his, and he held them. Not tightly, not possessively, but with a tenderness that asked nothing in return. Their shadows stretched out together on the polished gallery floor. Two very different lives, two kinds of strength, one rhythm. And when Evelyn turned to smile, really smile, it wasn't the polite kind reserved for public events. It was the kind that said, "I see you, all of you, and I'm still here." No fireworks, no confetti, just presence. And that was more than enough. The exhibit lingered into the evening like a whispered prayer, slow, warm, and filled with pauses that held more meaning than words ever could. As the lights dimmed and guests filtered through the gallery one last time, a soft spotlight settled on the largest painting, a quiet, haunting piece titled "The Final Frame." It didn't shout for attention. It breathed. Evelyn's handprints were in the texture, Kaylin's strokes hidden in the background shadows. It was them, broken, rebuilding, becoming. Standing before it, Evelyn addressed the lingering guests with her voice steady but soft. "Love," she said, "isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about seeing the beauty in what still breathes." A hush settled. Not every scar fades. Not every story gets a clean rewrite. But we can learn to live beautifully in the after. We can love from the ruins and still rise from them. Kaylin stood beside her, again, not in front, not behind. And in that final moment, the truth wasn't in their titles, their past, or even their pain. It was in their presence. In the way they chose each other, not despite the cracks, but because of them. Then, the frame faded to black. And this is where we speak to you. If this story made you feel something, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories like this, because love is still out there, and it's more real than you think.